Welcome back. Republicans on the Budget Writing Committee did not pass on funding to keep a school safety tip line alive after federal funding runs out at the end of this year. At the Department of Justice, the whole Office of School Safety could be affected. I spoke to Attorney General Josh Kaul earlier this week about those impacts. Attorney General, always good to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. We're talking today about what could be phrased as largely a defunding of the Office of School Safety. Give me the broad strokes of what happened in the Joint Finance Committee and why, I guess you could phrase this as a defunding.
The Office of School Safety was created right after the tragedy that took place at Parkland in 2018 to make sure that we had an office at the Department of Justice that was helping to keep schools around the state of Wisconsin safe. But the state provided pretty limited funding for that office itself. It provided a lot of money for grant programs. And so we've gone out and gotten federal grants to support some really innovative programs through that office. Those grant programs have allowed us to get these programs up and running and to have effective programs. And now we're at a point where we need long-term state funding to continue those programs over the long term. But rather than invest in those effective programs that are helping to keep schools safe, the Joint Finance Committee instead provided no additional funding, which means that those critical programs are going to need to be cut and our schools are going to lose those resources. And
my understanding is probably the most critical or top line program here would be the Tipline. Is that right?
That's one of the most critical things we do. There are a couple things that are evidence-based solutions that we know make schools safer based on data from around the country. One is having a confidential reporting system. That's what we had through our 24/7 Tipline, the Speak Up, Speak Out program. It's received thousands of contacts and gotten responses to people around the state to help keep schools safe. We also know that threat assessment protocols can help keep schools safe, and we've put out threat assessment protocol guidelines and have trained schools around the state on threat assessment. Both of those critical programs will be lost if we don't see the legislature take additional action to fund our Office of School Safety.
Let me ask you this. So this office was created under your predecessor, in fact, under the Walker administration, under Brad Schimmel, both Republicans. You're a Democrat. We saw you take the podium very recently with your former opponent in the last election, Eric Toney, also a Republican. I guess my question here is there any room to advocate alongside other Republicans in a bipartisan way to get funding, given that this was originally kind of a bipartisan effort?
We're going to pursue that. I'm hopeful that we will see Republican legislators support additional funding. I know that some have certainly been advocates for additional funding for the Office of School Safety. So we're going to try to find any partners we can to try to get the funding that we need passed. And the reason that this is so critical is because those vital services like the tip line and like the threat assessment training that goes on, we're going to lose those services, which will leave schools either without information about potential threats or scrambling to create their own local tip lines, spending local tax dollars, rather than having the effective statewide system we have in place now.
Let me read you the statement from Representative Mark Bourne. He's a Republican, of course, that co-chairs the Joint Finance Committee. Quote, the Joint Committee on Finance continued funding the Office of School Safety at current levels to continue performing the core functions of the office, along with funding $2.5 million in additional grants for critical incident mapping. Now, to just kind of put that in viewer lingo real quick, they're keeping their current levels of state funding the same. And what the other co-chair told me this morning was that, well, we don't want to be responsible for expanding government. What's your response to that?
Well, these are positions that already exist that were funded with federal grant funding. That's a good thing when we're bringing federal grant dollars into the state because it saves state taxpayer dollars. And the purpose of those kinds of sources of funding is so that states can develop successful programs like the Office of School Safety and can make evaluations about whether those programs should continue. Here we've got a program that has been highly effective and we have a historic budget surplus at the state level. There are a lot of things that the Joint Finance Committee is funding. I think that one of their priorities should be keeping our kids as safe as they can in schools.
If you don't get the money you need from the state, if you don't get potentially further federal grants to continue funding this, by the end of this year, the money runs out. Does that mean laying off the people or many of the people that currently work in that office?
Yeah, you know, I just had a conversation with folks in our Office of School Safety about the very difficult situation that we're in, and I told them that we're going to continue fighting for the resources we need. But if we don't get additional resources and authority to hire people in the Office of School Safety, we will lose those positions and people will be without the jobs they have currently. And we're going to lose those programs that help keep schools across the state of Wisconsin safe. You know, we've gotten over 100 tips with concerns about potential violence at schools where we've been able to get a response out. And of course, we don't know what would happen in any of those cases if there was no intervention. But if even one or two of those cases are ones where that intervention helped prevent violence, that is a very worthwhile investment for our Joint Finance Committee to make. And so I'm hopeful that they will look at this more closely and make the kind of investment we need to keep this program going, because keeping our kids safe in school shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's something that all legislators should be able to get behind.
Is a tip line of this nature, a sub-department of the DOJ of this nature, something that's reflected in a lot of other states? Are we going to be missing out on something that really puts us behind where other states are at?
There are a number of other states that do have tip lines. As I mentioned before, it's one of the things that has been shown to be evidence-based to keep kids safer in schools. And so there are other states that have programs like this. Without that, we would lose this program, which has been not only successful, but growing over the years. The number of tips that we've gotten has increased. And as students and school officials have seen that this program works, more people have signed up and more people have used it. You know, to give one example, we received a contact once about a student who a friend was worried might harm themselves. We made sure that a check-in happened so that somebody could check in on that student. Well, go forward a bit, that same student reached out directly to us. She was concerned about her own well-being, and she said, I'm reaching out to this program because I know it works, because when my friend reached out, I got the help that I needed. And those kinds of interventions help keep our kids safe. I can't think of a more worthwhile investment for our state government to be making.
Attorney General, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back.